Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webcast today. Should UCaaS be part of your unified communications strategy? Today's webcast will be a discussion on unified communications as a service. Should it be part of your UC strategy? So thank you all for being here. Let me introduce the panelists. The first panelist we have is Blair Pleasant. Blair is the president and principal analyst for ComFusion LLC and co-founder of UCStrategies.
Hi, everybody.
Her areas of focus include unified communications and collaboration, contact center, and social software products and solutions. Then we have Phil Edholm. Phil is president and principal analyst at PKE Consulting and UC expert from UCStrategies. He provides consulting and market research analysis to end users and vendors in the communications and networking markets. Phil has over 30 years experience in creating innovation and transformation in networking and communications.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Excellent. And now we have Joe Hines. He's the CEO and owner of Voice and Data Networks in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Joe founded VDN in 1995 and has guided it to be a trusted provider of communications products and services to the enterprise markets. VDN's focus areas include unified communications, Wi-Fi, Ethernet networking, contact center, audio and video conferencing, server support, storage, hosting support, network analysis and monitoring, and virtual CIO services to clients. The panelists, also, I want everybody to know that the panelists have some great offers available for the attendees that we're going to reveal at the end of the discussion today. And if you have any questions or comments, please enter them in the comment box below the live stream. We'll be monitoring the comments throughout the presentation and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the discussion. So if questions come up, just go ahead and type them in. And let's get started. Okay. So what we want to talk about is start out with what is unified communications, first of all, and then what is unified communications as a service? So let's just start with the what is unified communications piece and why is it important to the enterprise?
UCStrategies has a very simple definition for UC. It's communications integrated to optimize business processes. And what that means is there are different tools and capabilities that are integrated together with a unified client interface that help make it easier for workers to communicate, to collaborate, to see presence availability, to see the status of people, to be able to click to call, and basically making it easier to collaborate and work together. And part of the keys is having that unified interface so that everything is together, making it easier for people to have the tools that they need to get their work done.
Well, the way we view unified communications, and we're a provider of those services, is from the client's point of view, what business tasks are getting done via the underlying technology, which is unified communications. And the underlying technology includes a rather large grab bags of technology. It would be the telephony, the video audio conferencing, the interactive voice response units, voicemail, mobility units, the devices themselves, Wi-Fi, identity management, the SIP trunking and the circuits that go along with it. All these things are things that the client needs in order to communicate in their desired fashion, and integrating them as well as procuring them is a unified communications solution, and it's different for everyone, is what we have learned with painful experience.
All right, very good.
So I would argue, I think there are two dimensions to unified communications in terms of not so much the technology and the pieces, but rather the business impact. I mean, one dimension is unifying communication modalities together. Today we have lots of communication modalities. We have email, we have IM, we have voice, we have video. Bringing those together in a way that they're integrated and unified so that the user doesn't see them as each a separate choice, each a separate capability. That would be one dimension. The other dimension is, as Blair said, the impact on the business. And in the business, there are two major basic impacts. The first is for users that are knowledge workers who manage their own tasks, who manage their own personal business process, manage their own time, UC becomes a way that they enhance their collaboration capabilities by integrating those communication modalities very tightly with how they manage their collaborative activities to get work done. Typically that's where products like Link and fall. Then there's the other side, which is integrating communications into real-time formal business processes to accelerate the business process. When a problem emerges and someone needs to be involved, how quickly do you bring that person involved? So I think UC has two dimensions. We often only look at one of the dimensions. Obviously, bringing both of those together is critical to actually having the impact you want to have on your business, your organization.
Okay, very good. Does as a service, the UC as a service, does the as a service part automatically imply hosted? So again, I'm going to go around the room and get a sense for where you guys land on that subject. So again, let's just start with Blair.
Yeah, I know we've been talking about this. To me, as a service does mean hosted or cloud-based. Someone else is outsourcing the solution and providing it as a service to the end user. So the end user is getting it as a service. To me, it does mean hosted or cloud-based.
Okay.
So I know Joe's going to disagree with this a little bit, but.
All right, Joe, what do you say? Does as a service automatically imply hosted?
Well, I love that Blair and I disagree a little bit about this because I think that's the state of the market. The state of the market is trading terms and redefining terms, and that's what's going on. So what does it imply hosted for us? In part, yes. I think many of the technologies can and should be hosted, but many of the technologies should not be hosted. And as a service means it's a service to you, and you being the organization that's employing these tools. And so that could be professional services, and it could be on-premise wireless, and it could be off-premise telephony, or any combination thereof.
Okay, very good. And Phil, how do you weigh in on that? Does as a service automatically imply hosted?
So, I'm actually a big believer that we need to have some pretty pedantic definitions in this space. And I think a guy named Timothy Chow actually wrote a great book called The 6 Levels of Cloud Computing. It was not around our industry. It was rather around the computing industry. Timothy Chow, by the way, built at Oracle, the Oracle On Demand service between 2000 and 2004, and he's a lecturer today at Stanford. But he argues that there are these 6 levels going from level 1, which is basically you buy equipment, you deploy it in your site, you manage it and operate it with your own people, all the way to level 6, which is essentially the Google model, where people don't actually pay for the service with money as subscribers, rather it's monetized through other dimensions, i.e., Google monetizes your information to sell as advertising. I think if you look at that, there's a critical point. Level 2 is where you've owned the equipment, but you outsource the management and operation of that. So I think Joe's point here is you can turn your existing investment into a service by outsourcing the operation and management of that. I wouldn't call that UC as a service. I would rather call it management as a service. But I think then once we get to the point of saying, if you're buying a solution and it's a new solution without having a core capital purchase, it's now a service, because you are buying it on some sort of monthly basis. Now, by the way, I say core, often you will buy endpoints. For example, if you buy a voice over IP as a service or UC as a service and you buy IP phones, those are actually things you buy, but they're endpoints. They're not major capital purchases. They can be expense typically if you desire in your organization. So if you look at that, then there really are, I would argue, 3 models of a service. The first model is where it's a contracted service, but the physical equipment is premise located. Essentially, the end organization is giving the person who's selling the service a location to put that hosted equipment. The second is that you have physically dedicated equipment that is hosted off-site and hosted at some other location. The third is where you do not have physically dedicated equipment, and where, in fact, the service is a service that's designed where the equipment that's being used at the core is shared in a multi-tenant environment in a way that there's not a significant entry cost for the provider of the service to take you on as a new customer. And the analogy I use for this is very simple. If you go out and hire a gardener, and the gardener has to buy a $500 lawnmower to mow your lawn, and if they stop mowing your lawn, the lawnmower is going to get thrown away, they're going to ask you for a commitment of a year or two of $100 a month lawn service to be able to afford to buy the lawnmower and assure that they can pay it off. On the other hand, if they bring their own lawnmower to your house, they're just going to charge you $100 a month, and the only commitment in time is a discount on volume of time. So if you buy a monthly service, it's $100. If you buy it for a year, it's $900. So I think if you look at UCaaS as a service, it's important to understand all of those are service models in that you've taken away the initial capital purchase of the core, but you have to be cognizant of how they work. By the way, this all leads to the really important point that I think we're beginning to see in this industry, which is this whole concept of X as a service or cloud, whatever you want to call it, is really the industrial revolution of computing and now communications. Just like the industrial revolution changed the way products got built, way parts got built, this is going to change the way we do and use computing services. So, you know, just very quickly, because I think as a user, you need to understand why are you doing this. So, you know, in 1780, if you wanted to build an outhouse, you went to
Phil, wait a minute. I'm gonna interject here just a minute, and I'm sure we're gonna come back to some of what it is you're gonna cover, but we have a lot of questions.
Okay, that's cool.
And I think you answered it beautifully. Whether or not it's a service and the different service models, I think you outlined in a really excellent way. But let me ask this question. Does one delivery method, on-premise or hosted or hybrid, provide more benefits than the others? Or does it depend on the business, industry, or environment? And I'm going to toss that over to Joe, only from the standpoint that I think, Phil, you sort of covered some of that in what you were just talking about. But Joe, let's get your take on that.
So is one method provide more benefits than the other? I would say yes. And the reason I say yes is because in some cases, hosted is a much better solution. In some cases, premise is a much better solution. And in some cases, the combination of the two is a much better solution. And so the delivery method, and this is why I see, you know, UC as a service is very organic and wide, is that clients need some of it on site and they need some of it off site, or perhaps it's just more convenient for them to have some of it off site.
Yeah.
And so I think it depends on the business environment, and all are correct answers.
Okay. And Phil, really briefly, what do you think about that question? So is one delivery method, on-premise or hosted or hybrid, provide more benefits than the other, or does it depend on the business that the client is in, that the organization is in, their industry or their environment?
I think it's 100% business dependent, because again, if you come back to this, why are you doing UCaaS? And in the end, there only are two reasons to do UCaaS. It costs less money overall, or it has better delivery capability, i.e. availability or service. And really those are the two reasons. And so, you know, again, I think those are dependent on the organization's capability to manage and operate things, the organization's capability. But again, I was going back to the tour. The whole concept here is we are standardizing and repeating services and dramatically reducing the cost to deliver those. That's what cloud is all about. And UCaaS is a form of cloud. So again, as you evaluate this, I think you ultimately, it's not a technical question, it's a business question in the end.
Yep, definitely. Okay, very cool.
There's actually disagreement about whether the TCO and the overall cost of UCaaS or cloud or hosted is actually lower. So there have been studies that show that after like 3 to 5 years, the TCO of a hosted or a cloud service is actually higher. So that's why it's really more important to look at your business goals and what you're trying to achieve rather than the cost. It's really about what you as a business are trying to do.
Okay, all right, good enough. Now let me move to this question. Are the benefits and issues with UCaaS similar in on-premise versus a hosted deployment? So Joe, in terms of benefits or issues, and if you can provide any specifics that kind of people can put their arms around, that would be fabulous. but are the benefits and issues with UCaaS similar in an on-premise versus a hosted, or do you have different things you have to actually address?
Well, if I'm going to give a long answer all day, this is going to be the one. The way I look at it is, first of all, when you're dealing with communications, and we've proven this out with the use of our own cell phones, it is a very fluid technology, or excuse me, a fluid quality of use. Each one of us is trimming up our cell phones on a day-to-day basis in order for it to do things better for us. So now let's get to the business model. The best way for me to describe this is to say, the day you buy, by analogy, the day you buy an automobile, it is the best day of that automobile's life. It's got the best transmission it's ever going to have, and motor and suspension, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the automobile generally gets worse. Well, what I think that our friends at Apple, undiscussed item, did for us with the iPhone 3 is they said the day you get this product, certainly there's going to be limitations on the hardware, but the product keeps getting better. You get more apps, it does more things for you. So when you drive that whole, they turned it upside down when they did that. So instead of buying something and it gets worse, you buy something and from your perspective, it gets better. So how UCaaS can do that is, instead of buying it and have a TCO, okay, 5 years later I got a five-year-old unified communication solution. With UCaaS, the host provider, I'm back to Blair's thing, or the provider can continue to make the product morph into what you want it to do. And if you see the organization as the person at the end of the cell phone, then the organization keeps moving fluidly, and the UCaaS solution can keep moving fluidly with them. And I think this is the key element. And it sets it apart from things like inventory control, where you can buy it, put it in your stack, and leave it for a number of years with some software upgrades. Communications just isn't like that. People aren't like that. And right. I think it's critical.
Well, let me then flip this back over to Blair. So what, Joe, you just said, if I understood it correctly, is total cost of ownership is a different way you're even looking at it. Because if you look at a static system, you implemented it, and your total cost of ownership out over 5 years is, X. What you're saying is, wait a minute, that's for a static sort of, I implemented it, and now it's got, this is what the total cost is. What you're saying is, with a UCaaS implementation, it's going to constantly get better and stay updated in a different way than perhaps an on-premise solution would be. Is that what you essentially said?
It can. It depends on how you procure it, and we went through that before. Which model, hosted, hybrid, who are you going to have help you, those kinds of things. You want to put yourself in a position where you can do that, be fluid with the technology.
Yeah, and Blair, how does that change what you think around TCO? Or what, because the studies say one thing, but is what Joe's saying kind of have a point there?
Well, Joe always has a point. To me,
Thank you.
To me, the main thing is it's about the consumption model. You're still going to get the same benefits of unified communications. UC is going to do all the wonderful things for an organization, whether you get it on-premise, managed, hosted, whatever. So it's really how you're going to consume it as an individual, how you're going to access those capabilities. Now, one thing about UCaaS and I totally agree with Joe, you can get the latest and greatest without having to invest anymore. So the really nice thing about it, and when I talk to customers, I tell them to focus on this rather than the TCO or the cost, is that when you have something on-premise and you need to upgrade it, if you want to get the latest features, you're going to have to spend a lot of time and money, to get the latest release for everybody, to put the new software on everybody's desktop. It can be pretty time-consuming and expensive. With UCaaS, when the vendor or the service provider updates something and adds new capabilities, you get it automatically. So for companies of any size, that's really, really powerful, and I think that's part of what Joe is getting at. So you can get the latest and greatest automatically without doing any work. So that is very, very powerful. But I think the main thing really is to look at is, how do you want to consume it? So you understand that you want UC, you know all the great benefits it's going to give you. How do you want to consume it? Who's going to provide it for you? Do you want to be responsible for managing the day-to-day and upgrading and, you know, doing all that work, or do you want to outsource it to someone who has more, who has the expertise on it, who will let you focus on your core business rather than focusing on your communications? And that's really what it should come down to.
Okay, very good. And Phil, would you like to weigh in on this subject?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree. I think both of you made great points. I mean, the point here is that over time the functionality increases, and in order to keep that, you have to plan on doing regular upgrades. So if you're comparing, for example, UCaaS from an offer, you want to ask the vendor not to quote you just a basic software package, but quote you, for example, what they charge for subscription support. So subscription support, generally you buy a license and then you pay a percentage of the license, typically about 30% every year, and then you get all the updates and all that. And then what you have to do is plan on what's it going to cost me to install those updates. So I think it does come down to a TCO question about how does that TCO balance out of managing yourself and operating it. And the whole key point here that Joe makes is, in the end, UCaaS should reduce your cost, your total cost of ownership. But the other side, and don't lose track of this, that you also are getting the benefits of things like reliability and redundancy that if you don't build them into your premise solution, you're not going to get. So it's a complete trade-off. It's a very complete thought process you have to go through as to which one is going to be better in your situation, depending on your company and your implementation.
And I want to bolt on to Phil's comments real quick here. When and even in our case with our ERP system, if you get all those pieces and you build them into your contract, the upgrades and those pieces, that's a good thing and a powerful thing. But oftentimes I watch customers not take advantage of those things, because if they upgrade this, then this other piece that they already have bolted on isn't at the same level. And if they upgrade this, then this other piece can't be dragged along. And so it's not a one-look solution. You can buy subscription service for 5 or 6 of the options, and you probably have a group of, I've seen very few people have a group of under 4. Then each one depends on the other to make the whole thing work, and you will sometimes not take advantage of things because other pieces won't bolt on right. So the integration of communications is tremendously important, and I think better served in a UCaaS model, because then the technologists are dealing with those interdependencies, and you as the end user are not subject to them at the technology level.
Okay, very good. It looks like we answered a whole bunch of our questions right then. So what I'm going to do is jump into one that is, I think, just to earmark it and maybe get a little more detail about it, which is, how is communication sensitive to being fresh? In other words, being up to date. How is it sensitive to that? Phil, I'm going to let you kick off with that one, but how is communication sensitive to being fresh?
I assume when you mean fresh in terms of the newest versions of the application,
right,
those kind of things, versus being fresh in terms of the latest person who wants to talk to me.
Right.
So I think this is the thing that you need to really realize it's very important about, you see the communications industry, the communications space. We are, in fact, in a market that's moving very quickly. If you look back 10 years ago, I mean, just think about 10 years ago, voice over IP was something we were talking about whether it was going to happen and when it was going to happen. Voice over IP is the basis of everything we do today. The iPhone was introduced in 2007. The whole concept of BYOD is something that's emerged. So, I think having a vendor and a solution that has the capability and the commitment to adapt to these changes is absolutely critical. Because I can guarantee you, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about some new technologies, that if you look forward 2 years to this industry, it's going to be a dramatically different industry than it is today. And so I think having that fresh, and again, coming back to Joe's point, one of the critical opportunities in UCaaS is the complexity of managing those transitions, managing that new technology, implementing it, driving it. If you can essentially outsource that to someone who builds that across a large number of organizations, it has huge advantages for you in terms of being able to take care of those. And again, coming back to Blair's point, the value here is not the technology. The value is how does it change your business? And our business, our industry, the United States, in fact, has been driven by productivity gains for the last 20 years. This is the next big area of productivity gains, and you want to be positioned to take advantage of those. So you absolutely want to be fresh.
Very cool. And Joe, how would you answer that question in terms of communication sensitive to being fresh and up to date?
Well, I think it's really sensitive, and the best testament to it is watching people trim and prune and trim and prune and trim and prune their cell phones. People love to communicate in any way they'd like, and they continue to update it, put updates on, hey, have you seen my new app? And so you really have to go to the endpoint, which is the consumer. Even if that consumer is playing a role inside an organization, they want to communicate the way they want to communicate. And the guy next door's cool device or cool functionality is something they want. So being fresh is almost paramount now. It's almost expected. I don't know about paramount, maybe just expected, because it's coming at each and every individual from all other angles. And the curiosity of the entire populace is what's driving it. And I think it's really important.
And Kim, if I can add something,
sure.
I think when we look at unified communications, it's been evolving so much since we first started talking about it several years ago. Things like social software, social media, that wasn't even part of what we were talking about or thinking about a few years ago. So, and collaboration, the way that's become, it's whole, it's this whole thing unto itself. So UC has really evolved over the past years, and it's not what we first started with. So it really is important not only to be fresh, but to be open enough to be able to add all these new capabilities and new things that are being added to what we're calling unified communications.
Now, if I was to look at what size companies is UCaaS really targeted at, what size companies would most benefit from UCaaS? And I'm gonna say whoever jumps in first here.
I'll say all of them. I don't think there's, it really doesn't go by size to me. I mean, obviously it's a no-brainer for the, under 50, seats and less. For companies that, small companies with under 50 users, you don't need an IT person, you don't need, the expertise. For them, it makes absolute sense. But what's not as intuitive is like the really large companies, especially if they're distributed all over the world, or medium-sized companies that are geographically distributed and have offices in different locations. It really makes sense for them to not have to manage something at every specific individual site, and to have this provider who can take care of it at all the different sites. So for me, it's not size as much as, again, what's your business? What are you trying to achieve? Are you geographically distributed? If you're geographically distributed, I would say definitely look at UCaaS.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I think very much I would comment absolutely similarly. I think this is less a question of size, and again a question of what fits best your business model. Obviously the first question is, are you a capitally well-focused company? What you tend to see, by the way, if you look at voice over IP as a service, the average user, the average company using that today is typically in the 12 to 15 seat range. They're relatively small businesses, capital focused. On the other hand, if you look back a number of years ago in the days when we had the managed voice services, those tended to be actually purchased by large financial institutions and the government, both of whom again saw capital as being a significant issue. So I think there's a big decision there. I think the other point is to understand that, going back to Joe's point, hybrid brings the capability of using UCaaS as a way of not being all in, but being for part of your organization. So, if you have a 2,000 person main site office, you may decide at that office to use a premise-based solution, but you may decide for the users that are remote to buy a service and integrate it that way. So again, I think it's very dependent upon the organization. But what I will say is I think we're seeing a strong increase in the viability of UCaaS. And to me, it's really the change that we saw. If you think about answering machines 20 years ago, where I could buy an answering service for $5 a month, or I could buy a $30 answering machine. Well, somebody would say, if I've got $30 in 6 months, that's free. But if the answering if the answering service is 50 cents a month, it changes the equation. And I think that's one of the things you're seeing. I personally think you're going to see very dramatically in UCaaS over the next year or two, is that you're going to see the cost of service actually drop significantly, and therefore change this model dramatically. Which, by the way, is an interesting thought process, which says, maybe if you think it's going to cost the same for 5 years, it's not a good decision. But if you assume the cost is going to come down, it may actually be a good decision, because you're betting on that change in cost structures that's coming.
Very good, very good. And Joe, how about you? What size companies is a UCaaS service really targeted to? How do you weigh in on that one?
Well, I'd agree with Phil. I think it has to do with price. And I do think the prices are going to come down because, of course, the small companies are substantially more price sensitive than the larger companies. And, of course, the larger companies have scale, so that if they can, implement one feature and then go, 50,000 people wide, they get a lot of return on investment. But I think what's going to really turn the key here, because it's communication, is what the guy in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance likes to say: it's about quality. Because if you can buy it inexpensively as a small organization, but it doesn't work very well, or it's clunky, or people don't like to use it, it's toast. Same on the high side. So I don't think that size matters as much as what you want to do with it, and can you deliver it in a high quality manner. And that takes good qualitative, not quantitative thinking. The qualitative thinking will say, do I get the right provider? Is that provider providing good, strong technologies? Do they know how to integrate them for me? Because in the end, the whole thing, it's about the end user. Are they getting what they want? It's about them. And that's what's going to turn the key. Okay,
excellent. All right, now it's interesting. Here we are all on a Google Hangout recording this panel with a live audience. And if Google has all these apps, so we've got Google Talk, we've got Google Hangouts, why would an SMB, a small organization, want UCaaS over free applications like those from Google?
I'll start off, because so everybody who's not on the video side of this call doing a video doesn't realize we started setting this up an hour ago. And I think that's the indication. By the way, I think Google has amazing tools, and I think Google is looking to continue to provide this kind of service as something free. But again, remember back to what I said earlier. Google doesn't ever give anything away for free. This is not free. If you think this is free, you are wildly deceived. There was a great article about 2.5 years ago in Newsweek, back when they actually published a magazine. This guy wrote a column and he said, Google are the Dutch, we're the Indians, and we're selling Manhattan for beads. And his point was, Google gives us these great trinkets and we use them, but they're gathering information. By the way, Google has the right, and you clicked on this when you accepted this, they have the right to record and analyze everything that's said on this. And in fact, they are using that to build their transcription engine. Google also received a patent last year to deliver advertising based on what's said in a conversation, and that's why all of these conversations go through Google servers. So if you're a business, do you really want to have a communication solution that's free, where in fact your competitors are listening in on that your potential competitor is listening in on that conversation? Because if Google is selling the fact that I'm buying a car, and you're a car dealership, and I happen to be talking to you about buying a car on your Google supplied SMB system, and Google records that, and now I start seeing pop-up ads all over the web for other cars and other car dealers, is that really what you want to implement? And I think that's the biggest thing. You have to think about cost. Nothing is free. You pay for it one way or another. So, I mean, we could talk a lot about what Google doesn't have from a technology perspective, but I think the bigger question is, do you want Google monetizing your communications? Because it's not necessarily true that it is necessary in your interest to have them monetizing your communication. And by the way, I don't dislike Google. Don't get me wrong. I actually have no problem with what Google does. But as a business, communications is so essential to my business, my monetization process of my assets. I'm not sure I want to expose them to alternative monetization of my competitors.
Right.
Said.
I understand that. Now, but let me ask you this follow-on. Could SMBs get everything they need from Google from a UCaaS perspective? Could they even get everything?
I think they can get a reasonable set of technologies. I don't think they are, quite frankly, all that well integrated, as we saw this morning, trying to get, I have to be in your circle, you have to do this. I mean, trying to explain to a customer, to be able to have this video meeting with a customer is hugely complicated. So I think it's still very complicated. Will it get better? Absolutely. Will Google continue to provide that? Will there be other alternatives coming in the future? Absolutely. But again, I think, coming back to Joe's point about this is a tool to make your business better. It's not a technology you want to enjoy. And therefore, if you pay $10 a month or $20 a month for something, and if you can get it for free, but it costs your employees 15 minutes a month to use it, and your employees cost you $150 an hour, you didn't make money off it. It wasn't a good business decision. So I think the question is, Google, the technology is still not well integrated. You can do things. I use Google Voice for my office number. I like it, but again, I'm not sure I would recommend to a larger SMB that this was the choice to make for your total communication system today.
Clear.
Yeah, that's
clear.
I was going to say the same exact thing. I use Google Voice and I love it and it's wonderful. But I'm a one-person operation. If I had 15 people, it probably wouldn't be the right type of solution. But also, we don't know about the security, the privacy, confidentiality, integration, all those things. I mean, Google is wonderful for what it does, but it's not offering an enterprise-grade solution right now, and it's not even saying that it is.
I think. Please finish. Well, I think there's another psychological point to be made here. If I'm using a business application like inventory control, I must use the company's inventory control. But when I'm using a communications application, and I'm the end user way out on the edge, and somebody starts to explain it to me, and it's clunky and it's hard, what I do is I just ignore it. I just ignore it, and I come around the backside, and I call somebody on a copper wire or something like that. Right. And so the adoption is very different when you talk about communication.
And I think the important point, Joe, that you've made there is the value of UC is in both hard and soft benefits. It's hard benefits, moving calls over to SIP, eliminating long distance meeting, managing conferencing. It's the soft benefits of saving people time in the business and being able to be more productive. So if your business is going to grow over the next 3 to 4 years, 5 years, your business is going to grow 20%, you don't have to hire 20% more people. If the solution you give people they don't use, you're not going to get those benefits. You're not going to get the cost reductions. You're not going to get the productivity benefits, and therefore you haven't taken advantage of it. And I think that's the question is Google for the average person that you're trying to do? Because remember, we're not delivering UC to the IT department. We're delivering it to our entire employee base. We're delivering it to that salesman who doesn't really care about technology. They care about booking an order. We're that service technician. Those people, their adoption characteristics are as critical. And I think the challenge is Google tools for us are great, but that's because we're those techno-weenies.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. Let me kind of open this question up. What's the challenge that companies face regarding accurately defining user communication requirements? So you talk about the challenge of employee adoption, and we kind of jumped into that, but let's talk about the challenge of accurately defining the UC requirements for your organization.
Well, I think the issue is that it's going to be different for everybody, and right now the IT person is responsible for deploying and purchasing unified communications, but it's the business users, it's the line of business people that are using UC, and the IT people don't always know what it is that these line of business people need. So the receptionist is going to need something different from the salesperson, who's going to need something different from the engineer. So it's really important to focus on the different use cases and the different ways that people are using unified communications. It's not about technology, and we say that over and over. The technology is the last thing that should, come into play. It's really, what are the use cases, how are people using it, what are their communication channels, how are the individual people using this? And that's where it really, these individual line of business people have to be brought into the decision. They have to be brought into the conversation. It's not an IT discussion. It really has to go way beyond that. And that's why it's important to have an evangelist, someone from the top who can really bring all these different people together. And yes, IT is absolutely part of this and plays an important role, but these line of business people are equally important. So someone at the top has to bring all these different people together when it comes to making the decision and figuring out what's required.
Yeah.
And I think on that same point that there's a psychological shift occurring. I've been in IT long enough to say that we used to actually write the code. We wrote general ledger, and we had people that went to the end user and said, what are you doing that I can automate? But as second and third and fourth generation languages came along, IT stopped doing that and just started building networks and managing really good applications, but managing the technology. And what's coming back now around the circle is the end users are getting back involved, and that's a psychological shift. I think much of the IT departments look to the business for the requirements has been riffed out of the business, and so now they're starting to come back, and the end users are saying, hey, where's my support here? And the end users are saying, well, I'm going to have to build it myself, and now they've got people that are business systems analysts that do they work for the business, or do they work for the IT department? And this psychological shift is going on inside the enterprise, which used to be there 25 or 30 years ago, and it's coming back. And I think it's hard. It's very difficult.
Yeah, I'll just make a very quick comment, and one of these, there are different kinds of workers. There are service workers, information workers, and knowledge workers. Information and service workers, basically, service workers don't use information in the process of their job. Information workers, contact center agents, folks like that do use in the process of their job a bank teller. Knowledge workers are people who actually manage their own time. They have a calendar, they manage their own events, they have an email account. Everyone on this call is a knowledge worker. One of the things that's really important is what a lot of us think of UC is actually a knowledge worker tool. Integrating with your email, integrating, collaboration meetings, those kind of things is actually a knowledge worker tool. What's interesting is most companies, knowledge workers are only 15 to 25% of the employee base. The majority are information and service workers. In order to get the benefits for information and service workers, you almost by definition have to integrate to the business process they follow. And this comes back to, I think, what Blair said earlier. You really need to engage those business line managers to have that benefit. By the way, just an aside, if anyone's interested in understanding a bit more of that, if you go to the PKE Consulting website, there's a white paper on the whole concept of knowledge workers, service workers, and information workers. It's called KISS, and how you manage that, the knowledge worker, information service worker structure. Before you even engage with your organization to talk about UC, I think you need to understand your employee base, because it's dependent upon your vertical business, what you do, how your employees work. And if you don't get that right, you will totally misunderstand the benefit value to your organization of UC.
Okay, very good. Now, we're coming up to the end here, so I'm going to do a couple more questions to try and get us through our last couple subjects. So we're going to keep them brief. But what's the role of the VAR in UCaaS? So the value-added reseller, what's that role? Can you talk about the distinction between those two roles in terms of UC? So what's the role of the VAR? And I'm going to start with Joe on this one.
Well, okay, I'll start, but I was hoping you'd start with the other guys, because it's my and we are a VAR. But I'll start anyway. I believe what the role of the VAR is emerging to, and it's continuing to morph, but I think what the role of VAR is emerging to is that the VAR is helping the end user determine from the business what they need. I will say that 10 years ago, this company as a VAR was the tail of the dog. The dog was the OEM, whatever OEM we were following, Cisco, Avaya, whatever, and we were the tail of the dog, and we worked with them, and we did fulfillment and things like that. And today, it is not 100% switch, but we are not the tail of the dog anymore. The client wants the VAR to do some of this work for them, and then go forward to the solution. And it's commonly a multi-vendor solution, and so the VAR needs to have multi-vendor technology capabilities.
Okay,
so I think
very good.
That's what I think it is.
Yeah, that's excellent. Now what I'm going to move on to here is the value of UCaaS. What is a reasonable ROI to expect? And just a quick answer, what's the ROI we should be evaluating against? I'm going to toss this over to Phil.
So obviously ROI is going to change for every organization, but I'll tell you one of the things, and Joe's familiar with this, we at UCStrategies and Blair and I have been intimately involved in this, have built a UC benefit and ROI tool that literally in about 15 minutes can generate an anticipated ROI for your organization. What's interesting, we've run literally hundreds of these models for hundreds of different kinds of organizations, and we often find that the payback is measured in months. It's not measured in years, it's measured in months. And the reason is very simple, is if you adopt UC and how it changes your organization, the business impact can be significant. From cost savings, that are hard costs in conferencing and minutes, but also in terms of just imagine if every time a person goes to a meeting, that meeting could start 2 minutes earlier, maybe not even start on time, but instead of being 5 minutes after the hour, it could start 3 minutes after the hour. Does that productivity gain translate into effectiveness so you can grow your business? And again, in the economic growth we're going to see in the next 5 years, the monetization of this, I think, is going to be key for a lot of organizations to succeed. So,
Right.
and again, we don't have enough detail to go through it, but I know, Joe, for those of you that are listening to this and working with voice data networks, I'd ask you to talk to them and say, hey, look at how this can impact my organization, because I guarantee you it's one of the best investments you can make in IT today in terms of ROI. It has a great payback, and it's equivalent to things that people talk about having excellent paybacks like virtualization.
But again, you need to look at the business benefits and, tying it in with the business processes. If you're just looking to, for people to save, 10 minutes from their day because they can see, who's available and, not call them or leave a voice message because you can tell that their present status, that they're away. That's not what it's about. It's not about saving that 20 minutes a day. It's about integrating into the business processes, being able to more easily collaborate, being able to reduce the time that it takes for a business process to get finished. So that's what you really need to be looking at, not, can I save 10 minutes off of my day?
Yep, very good. Okay, now I'm going to move us to predictions for UCaaS. So each one of you, we're going to go around, but what's your prediction? What will a UCaaS offering include in the future? If the foundation for it is currently voice, will more functions be added as a standard offering? Or will other communications technologies always be offered a la carte? So what do you think the future is? Phil, we'll start with you. Just your 10 seconds. What do you think?
Better. No, I'd say the biggest thing I think is going to happen in this industry, and it's the communication industry in general, is this technology called WebRTC. And everybody kind of laughs because I talk about it a lot, but WebRTC is going to change the world. What happened 20 years ago with information, what browsers and URLs and the web did for information, the explosion of 20 million websites managing communications, or managing information, is going to happen to communications in the next 3 to 5 years. And I think it's going to make UCaaS a lot easier, a lot more effective, and it's going to end up having a huge impact on cost. And I think in the end, by the way, coming back to Joe's point, the technology is going to be an order of magnitude better in 3 years. The challenge is going to be, how do you get your organization to adopt it, use it, change your business process, take advantage of it, and compete in your market. So I think this is personally, I think it's the future of communications. It's a there's a fundamental transformation coming, and it's the intersection of UCaaS, cloud, and things like and technologies like WebRTC that change the way the endpoints communicate.
Okay, very good. And Joe, how do you weigh in on that? Predictions for UCaaS, your 10 seconds.
Well, I think that I point at integration. I think anything that slows it down is going to be integration. The clients do need these business processes, which is what Blair's saying. They need the technologies, which is a little bit more what Phil's saying. But do they work for me? I think the mental and the psychological structure of the organization that's going to change is going to change around integrating them into the technologies into each other and the people processes and the work processes. And that if there's going to be a break on it in the enterprise, that's going to be the break. And I think that's currently the break. And I think that can get better because the technologies will make that simpler.
Okay. And Blair?
Yeah, I think the future is something that I'm calling optimized communications instead of unified communications. So it's the use of specific communication and interaction tools and technologies for businesses and organizations to optimize their business goals while enhancing the user experience. So I think the focus is really on the user experience, letting them use the device they want, the channel they want, being whatever location, whatever consumption model, really making it more flexible and optimized to the end user and what they want to do and what they're trying to achieve.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, what we're going to do now is open up for questions from folks. So, okay, what are the downsides of UCaaS?
So this is Phil. I would suggest that probably the one downside everyone should be aware of is if you move to UCaaS, which is a non-premise cloud-based solution, whether it's a hosted or a pure service-based solution, you've now moved that away from your users. So you're now dependent upon your network connectivity to deliver that service. And obviously there's mitigation to this. You can use multiple network paths. The fact is you have multiple devices because if you've integrated with mobile, my mobile phone works as well as a device as my desktop device. But I think having a well thought out strategy for how you're going to assure that your users have a continuity of service is really important as you go into this. And it's one of the downside and differences of a traditional premise-based solution as you move out into an off-premise cloud or service-based offer.
Okay. Blair, what do you say about that? Downside of UCaaS?
Yeah, the biggest complaint I hear from people is the loss of control because you are giving the control to the provider, whoever that is. So the loss of control, also in some cases the lack of the ability to do customization because again if we're looking at a traditional hosted type of capability, it is harder to customize for the specific user. So those are the two main things that I hear about. Okay,
Joe.
I'm going to basically say the same thing as Blair said in a little bit different way, and that is, and I'll say it, and it doesn't help me as an organization. By way of analogy, one of the things I'm gonna pick on Cisco here, not because I don't like Cisco, they got a very nice product, but they got great big market share. So if you take your organization and say we standardize on Cisco, and we're not going to buy anything but Cisco, then your next feature as a corporation is dependent on whether or not Cisco provides that feature to you. So that locks you into a certain extent. Now, if you buy UCaaS and it's only hosted, then your next feature is the only hosted option. So I think that the downside of it is getting yourself locked into just this hosted application or just that one or just this or just that, because the innovation comes from the edge. And I'm not picking on Cisco. I'm saying it's brilliant. One of the things they've done is they've said, hey, the innovation's out there in the world. We're not going to try and innovate everything. We're just going to buy those innovative companies. And that's what they've done, and they've done an excellent job of it. So those new hot features are going to come from the edge, and you need to set yourself up in a very flexible way so you can continue to derive the newest, latest, greatest benefit.
Okay, very good.
Can I just reflect on that comment, just one comment? I mean, I think, again, back to the cloud model. The concept in cloud is the way cloud reduces cost is by standardization repetition, and ruthless cost reduction. You know, that hinge, instead of being managed bespoke by a local blacksmith, is now manufactured in the tens of thousands or millions, but they're all exactly the same. And the point here that I think Joe and Blair both brought up is UCaaS is all about accepting what the UCaaS provider is giving you, not trying to decide what you need. And if I can reflect on a song, it's being happy with what you've got, not wanting what you don't have. And I think you have to be willing to understand. Now, I will say the following. I think with those vendors that are doing that are probably 99% right in terms of the service that they're going to be delivering. So I think that's one of the things, is that we're in many ways, a maturing industry in some areas. So, you know, being comfortable with that. And the question is, you know, are you willing to pay 2 or 3 times as much for that one feature that you used to use 5 years ago, or can you live without it? And that's the kind of discussion you have to have. And the downside is you may have to go to a user and say, you can't do that anymore. And they're going to say, well, why are you taking that away from me? You can say, because I'm saving the company $500,000 a year, and it's going to cost me $500,000 to give you that one thing. And I think that's a tough discussion to have, and that's one of the downside.
As a roundup, as a final statement, so Blair, let's start with you. Anything that you would like to add to the conversation, just as a footnote and an ending?
Sure. Whether it's hosted, premise, whatever, the key for unified communications is focus on the end user, and don't forget about end user training. That's really, really important. So many times we think, you know, this is intuitive, you know, it's easy to use, whatever, and people forget about end user training and the impact on the end user, and that's really what we should be focusing on, is how is the end user going to adopt it, and how can we make it easier for them.
Excellent. Hey, Joe, how about you?
Well, I'm going to steal a line that I heard from Phil maybe 1 or maybe 2 years ago. Cloud, or as a service, is not a technology. It's a business model. And you have to set yourself up in a flexible enough business model. Then you turn around and you address yourself to technology. And for my money, the biggest change that's going on now is the role of IT is changing from technologist to technology application provider. And that's the role of the people inside the enterprise, and the role of the VARs and the OEMs is changing to those people that actually deliver new, latest and greatest features and integration of those features.
Okay, very good. And Phil?
So as you know, as a UC person in your organization, whether you're an organization or a VAR, the conversation needs to start as a business conversation. I think we've all said that. You need to, and that conversation doesn't start by, let me show you some features. It starts by understanding and talking about how you can change the organization. And I think that's absolutely the critical point. You know, telephony was nothing more than a base utility service. Everybody had to have a phone. Everybody had to have voicemail. Everybody ignored it once you paid for it. UC is not telephony. If you think and apply telephony thought processes to dealing with the organization in UC, I guarantee you your application will fail and you will fail as an individual. And I think that's the critical point. Think about this as something new and transformational.
Okay, very good. All right, so moving along, thank you guys so much for participating. I really appreciate it. And now we're going to talk about the offers that we've got. So participants in today's UCaaS webcast will receive an abridged version of Blair Pleasant's comprehensive market study, Unified Communications and Collaborations Market 2012 through 2013.
16.
Okay, through 2016. All right. Apologies. I knew that we had changed that date. Unified Communications and Collaboration Market 2012 through 2016 helps end user organizations, vendors, and channel partners better understand the UCC market as it evolves. The complete report is valued at $2,495 and includes detailed information and insights on the UC drivers, challenges, key players, technology trends, and market forecasts, as well as presenting vendor leadership evaluations in several areas. So the abridged version of this is going to be made available free, and thank you so much, Blair, for making that available. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Blair.
Yep. And VDN's offer, Voice and Data Networks, is going to be raffling off a Plantronics Voyager Legend UC headset, and this is one of the top headsets on the market today, to one lucky attendee, and we're going to let you know via email that you won. The Plantronics Voyager Legend is the only headset system needed for a seamless and intuitive everywhere communications experience for the mobile reality facing users today. So it's a great headset, and so we're going to be raffling that off. And then we also have something from Phil. So Phil, I'm going to let you kind of say what that is real quickly, and then we'll wrap up.
Outstanding, Kim. So a couple of things that I'll provide. If anyone wants to send me an email, and we'll say that email address will come out on the email, I'll actually send you a tool that we built for analyzing Link versus Jabber. I know for a lot of organizations, deciding on Cisco and Microsoft as your UC vendor is a critical point. I mentioned WebRTC. We didn't talk a lot about that. If you're interested in that, there's a UC WebRTC conference coming up in November, and you'll be able to get a 50% discount to that if you'd like to attend. And finally, I'll provide the white paper on the knowledge worker, information service worker to CDN, and have them mail those out to you, which I think will be helpful. It's helpful in you understanding how to apply UC to your organization and thinking about your own personal strategy of application. So a few tools for you to use. So thanks much.
Thank you so much, Phil. That's awesome. So anyways, I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our panelists for being so gracious and generous with your time and your expertise. And that's it. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Blair.
Thanks again.
It's been fun.